Do you have freedom? In essence, are you allowed to be you? Do you have the quality or state of being free? The power to do as one pleases, freedom from physical restraint, freedom from arbitrary or despotic control, the power of choice? Are you sovereign? That is the liberty mindset. Let us foster our curiosity and seek the truth. Always helps if you unmute the microphone. Welcome, 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 visitors. And this is chapters 7 and 8 from Ludwig von Mises' Planned Chaos. Today we look first in chapter 7, Fascism. When the war broke out in 1914, the Italian Socialist Party was divided as to the policy to be adopted. One group clung to the rigid principles of Marxism. This war, they maintained, is a war of the capitalist. It is not seemly to be for the proletarians to side with any of the belligerent parties. The proletarians must wait for the Great Revolution, the civil war of the United Socialists against the United Exploiters. They must stand for Italian neutrality. The second group was deeply affected by the traditional hatred of Austria. In their opinion, the first task of the Italians was to free their unredeemed brethren. Only then would the day of the Socialist Revolution appear. In this conflict, Benito Mussolini, the outstanding man in Italian socialism, chose at this orthodox Marxian position. Nobody could surpass Mussolini in Marxian zeal. He was the intransigent champion of the pure creed, the unyielding defender of the rights of the exploited proletarians, the eloquent prophet of the socialist bliss to come. He was an adamant adversary of patriotism, nationalism, imperialism, monarchical rule, and all religious creeds. When Italy in 1911 opened its great series of wars by an insidious assault upon Turkey, Mussolini organized violent demonstrations against the departure of troops for Libya. Now, in 1914, he branded the war against Germany and Austria as an imperialist war. He was then still under the dominating influence of Angelika Baladinov, the daughter of wealthy Russian landowner. Ms. Baladinov had initiated him into the subtleties of Marxism. In her eyes, the defeat of the Romanov counted more than the defeat of the Habsburgs. She had no sympathy for the ideals of the Risorgimento. But the Italian intellectuals were first of all nationalist. As in all other European countries, most of the Marxians longed for war and conquest. Mussolini was not prepared to lose his popularity. The thing he hated most was not to be on the side of the victorious faction. He changed his mind and became the most fanatical advocate of Italy's attack on Austria. With French financial aid, he founded a newspaper to fight for the cause of the war. The anti-fascists blamed Mussolini for the defection from the teachings of rigid Marxism. He was bribed, they say, but the French by the French. Now even these people should know that the politicians of a newspaper requires funds. They themselves do not speak of bribery if a wealthy American provides a man with money needed for the publication of a fellow traveler newspaper, or if funds mysteriously flow into the communist publishing firms. It is a fact that Mussolini entered the scene of world politics as an ally of the democracies, while Lenin entered it as a virtual ally of Imperial Germany. More than anybody else, Mussolini was instrumental in achieving Italy's entry into the First World War. His journalist propaganda made it possible for the government to declare war on Austria. Only those few people have a right to find fault with his attitude. In the years of 1914 to 1918, we realized that the disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire spelled the doom of Europe. Only those Italians are free to understand that the only means of protecting the Italian-speaking minorities in the littoral districts of Austria against the threatening annihilation of the Slavic majorities was to preserve the integrity of the Austrian state, who constitutionally guaranteed equal rights of all linguistic groups. Mussolini was one of the most wretched figures of history, but the fact remains that his first great political deed still meets with the approval of all his countrymen and the immense majority of his foreign detractors. When the war came to an end, Mussolini's popularity dwindled. The communists swept into popularity by events in Russia, carried on, but the great communist venture, the occupation of the factories in 1920, ended in complete failure. and the disappointed masses remembered the former leader of the Socialist Party. They flocked to Mussolini's new party, the Fascists. The youth greeted with turbulent enthusiasm the self-styled successors of the Caesars. Mussolini boasted in later years that he had saved Italy from the danger of communism. His foes passionately dispute these claims. Communism, they say, was no longer a real factor in Italy when Mussolini seized power. The truth is that the frustration of communism swelled the ranks of the fascists and made it impossible for them to destroy all other parties. The overwhelming victory of the fascists was not the cause, but the consequences of the communist fiasco. The program of the fascists, as drafted in 1919, was vehemently anti-capitalistic. The most radical New Dealers and even communists would agree with it. When the fascists came to power, they had forgotten those points of their program, which referred to the liberty of thought and the press as a right of assembly. And in this respect, they were conscientious disciplines of Bukharin and Lenin. Moreover, they did not suppress, as they had promised, the industrial and financial corporations. Italy badly needed foreign credits for the development of its industries. The main problem for fascism in the first years of its rule was to win the confidence of the foreign bankers. It would have been suicidal to destroy the Italian corporations. Fascist economic policy did not, at the beginning, essentially differ from those of other Western nations. It was a policy of interventionism. As the years went on, it more and more approached the Nazi pattern of socialism. When Italy, after the defeat of France, entered the Second World War, its economy was by and large already shaped according to the Nazi pattern. The main difference was that the fascists were less efficient and even more corrupt than the Nazi. But Mussolini could not long remain without the economic philosophy of his own invention. Fascism posed a whole new philosophy, unheard of before and unknown on all other nations. It claimed to be the gospel which the resurrected spirit of the ancient Rome brought to the decaying democratic peoples whose barbarian ancestors had once destroyed the Roman Empire. It was the consummation both of the half-Italian word, Renascimento and Risorgimento of every aspect. The final liberation of the Latin genius from the yoke of foreign ideologies, its shining leader, the peerless Duce, was called upon to find the ultimate solution for the burning problems of society's economic organization and of all social justice. From the dust heap of discarded socialist utopias, the fascist scholars salvaged the scheme of a guild socialism. Guild socialism was very popular with British socialists in the last years of the First World War and in the first years following the armistice. It was so impracticable that it disappeared very soon from socialist literature. No serious statement ever paid any attention to contradictory and confused plans of guild socialism. It was almost forgotten when the fascists attached it to a new label and flamboyantly proclaimed cooperativism as the new social panacea. The public inside the outside of Italy was captivated. Innumerable books, pamphlets, and articles were written in praise of the Stato Cooperativo. The governments of Austria and Portugal were soon declared that they were committed to the noble principles of corporativism. The papal encyclical quadragesimo anno, the papal encyclical quadragesimo anno, 1931, contains some paragraphs which would be interpreted but need not be as an approval of corporativism. In France, its ideas found many eloquent supporters. It was mere idle talk. Never did the fascists make any attempt to realize the corporatist program. Industrial self-government, they changed the name of the chambers of commerce into corporate sounds. Cooperative councils, sorry. Let me read that sentence again. They changed the name of the chambers of commerce into cooperative councils. They called corporazioni the compulsory organizations of various branches of industry, which were the administrative units of the executive of the German pattern of socialism they had adopted. But there was no question of the corporazianos' self-government. The fascist cabinet did not tolerate anybody's interference with its absolute authoritarian control of production. All the plans of the establishment of the cooperative system remained a dead letter. Italy's main problem is its comparative overpopulation. In an age of barriers to trade and migration, the Italians are condemned to subset permanently on a lower standard of living than that of the inhabitants of the countries more favored by nature. The fascists saw only one means to remedy this unfortunate situation: conquest. They were too narrow-minded to comprehend that the redress they recommended was spurious and worse than evil. They were moreover so entirely blinded by self-conceit and vainglory that they failed to realize that their provocative speeches were simply ridiculous. The foreigners whom they insolently challenged knew very well how negligible Italy's military forces were. Fascism was not its Fascism was not. Its advocates boasted an original product of the Italian mind. It began with a split in the ranks of the Marxian socialism, which certainly was an imported doctrine. Its economic program was borrowed from German non-Marxism socialism, and its aggressiveness was likewise copied from the Germans, al duce, or pan-German forerunners of the Nazis. Its conduct of government affairs was a replica of Lenin's dictatorship. Corporatism, its much advertised ideological adornment, was of British origin. The only homegrown ingredient of fascism was the theatrical style of its processions, shows, and festivals. The short-lived fascist episode ended in blood, misery, and ignominy. But the forces which generated fascism are not dead. Fanatical nationalism is a feature common to all present-day Italians. The communists are certainly not prepared to renounce their principle of dictatorial oppression of all dissenters. Neither do the Catholic parties advocate freedom of thought, or of the press, of religion. There are in Italy only very few people indeed who comprehend that the indispensable prerequisite of democracy and the rights of men is economic freedom. It may happen that fascism will be resurrected under a new label and with new slogans and symbols. But if this happens, the consequences will be detrimental, for the fascism is not, as a fascist trumpeted, a new way of life. It is rather an old way towards destruction and death. Okay, that brings us to the end of Chapter 7, Fascism. Some interesting things going on in there. How tightly tied fascism and communism actually are. We keep using that term fascism, I think, very incorrectly in this country in modern days. Fascism is anything that's not socialist, and that's actually completely incorrect. Do I think that America is turning fascist? Absolutely. When you look at the economic structure of free markets and the fact that we don't have one, we don't have a legal one, I should say. Everything is so regulated by the government. It's, sort of nudged by the government. And that corporate federal, shall we say, cooperation or oppression, the federal oppression of the corporate, is fascism by the actual definition. Now we're going to talk about Chapter 8, Nazism. The philosophy of the Nazis, the German National Socialist Labor Party, is the purest and most consistent manifestation of anti-capitalist and socialist spirit of our age. Its essential ideas are not German or Aryan in origin, nor are they peculiar to the present-day Germans. In the genealogical tree of Nazi doctrine, such Latins as Sismondi and Georges Sorel, and such Anglo-Saxons as Carlyle, Ruskin, Houston Stewart, Chamberlain, were more conspicuous than any German and even the best-known ideological attire of Nazism. The fable of the superiority of the Aryan master race was not of German provenance. Its author was a Frenchman, Gobineau. Germans of Jewish descent like Lassalle, Lasson, Stahl, and Walter Rathenau contributed more to the essential tenets of Nazism than such men as Sombart, Spahn, Ferdinand Fried, the slogan into which the Nazis condensed their economic philosophy vis-a-vis Je m'annonce gut als, and I did that very badly, and I apologize in all retrospect. The translation is, the common weal ranks above private profit. Is likewise the idea underlying the American New Deal and the Soviet management of economic affairs. It applies that profit-seeking business harms the vital interest of the immense majority, and that it is a sacred duty of the popular government to prevent the emergence of profits by public control of production and distribution. Interesting. Sorry. The only specialty German ingredient in Nazism was in striving after the conquest of Lebensraum, and this, too, was an outcome of their agreement with the ideas guiding the principles of the most influential political parties of all other countries. These parties proclaimed income equality as the main thing. The Nazis do the same. What characterized the Nazis is the fact that they are not prepared to acquiesce to a state of affairs in which the Germans are doomed forever to be imprisoned, as they say, in a comprehensively small and overpopulated area in which the productivity of labor must be smaller than the comparatively underpopulated countries, which are better endowed with natural resources and capital goods. They aim at a fairer distribution of Earth's natural resources. As a have-not nation, they look at the wealth of the richer nations with the same feelings with which many people in the Western countries look at the higher incomes of some of their countrymen. The progressives in the Anglo-Saxon countries assert that liberty is not worth having for those who are wronged by the comparative smallness of their incomes. The Nazis say the same with regard to international relations. In their opinion, the only freedom that matters is Narrenschied. Okay, let's try that again. Narrenschied, meaning freedom from importing foods. They aim at the acquisition of territory so large and so rich as natural resources that they would live in economic self-sufficiency, at a standard not lower than that of any other nation. They considered themselves as revolutionaries fighting for their inalienable and natural rights against the vested interests of hosts of the reactionary nations. It is easy for economists to explode the fallacies involved in the Nazi doctrines, but those who disparage economics as orthodox and reactionary and frantically support the spurious creeds of socialism and economic nationalism were at a loss to refute them, for Nazism was nothing but the logical implication of their own tenets to the popular conditions of a comparatively overpopulated Germany. For more than 70 years, the German professors of political science, history, law, geography, and philosophy were eagerly imbued with their disciples with a hysterical hatred for capitalism, and preached the war of liberation against the capitalist West. The German socialists of the chair, much admired in all foreign countries, were the peacemakers of their two world wars. At the turn of the century, the immense majority of Germans were already radical supporters of socialism and aggressive nationalism. There were then already firmly committed to the principles of Nazism. What was lacking and was added later and was only a new term for this to signify their doctrine. When the Soviet policies of mass extermination of all dissenters and the ruthless violence removed the inhibitions against wholesale murder, which still troubled some of the Germans, nothing could any longer stop the advance of Nazism. The Nazis were quick to adopt the Soviet methods. They imported from Russia the one-party system, the preeminence of this party in political life, the paramount position assigned to the secret police, the concentration camps, the administrative execution of imprisonments of all opponents, the extermination of the families of suspects and of exiles, the methods of propaganda, the organization of affiliated parties abroad, and their employment for fighting their domestic governments and espionage and sabotage, the use of the diplomatic and consular service of fomenting revolution, and many other things besides. There were nowhere more docile disciples of Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin than the Nazis were. Hitler was not the founder of Nazism. He was its product. He was, like most of his collaborators, a sadistic gangster. He was uneducated and ignorant. He had failed even in the lower grades of high school. He never had an honest job. It is a fable that he had ever been a paper hanger. His military career in the First World War was rather, mediocre. The first class Iron Cross was given to him after the end of the war as a reward for his activities as a political agent. He was a maniac obsessed by megalomania, but learned professors nourished his self-conceit. Werner Sombart, who once had boasted that his life was devoted to the task of fighting the ideas of Marx, Sombart, whom the American Economic Association had elected to honorary membership and many non-German universities to honorary degrees, candidly declared that Führertum means a permanent revelation that the Führer received his orders directly from God, the supreme Führer of the universe. The Nazi plan was more comprehensive and therefore pernicious than that of the Marxians. It aimed to abolish laissez-faire not only in the production of material goods, but no less in the production of men. The Führer was not only the generation manager of all industries, he was also the general manager of the breeding farm intent upon rearing superior men and eliminating inferior stock. A grandiose scheme of eugenics was to be put into effect according to, quote, scientific, end quote, principles. It is vain for the champions of eugenics to protest that they did not mean what the Nazis executed. Eugenics aims at placing some men, backed by the police power, in complete control of human reproduction. It suggests that the methods applied to domestic animals be applied to men. This is precisely what the Nazis tried to do. The only objection which a consistent eugenist can raise is that his own plan differs from that of the Nazi scholars, and that he wants to rear another type of men than the Nazis. As every supporter of economic planning aims to the education of his own plan, only so every advocate of eugenic planning aims at the execution of his own plan and wants himself as the breeder of human stock. Pause. Dramatic. Pause. The eugenists pretend that they are not to eliminate criminal individuals, but the qualification of a man as a criminal depends upon the prevailing laws of the country and varies with the change in social and political ideologies. John Hus, Gordiano Bruno, Galileo Galilei were criminals from the point of view of the laws which their judges applied. When Stalin robbed the Russian state bank of several million rubles, he committed a crime. Today, it's an offense in Russia to disagree with Stalin. In Nazi Germany, sexual intercourse between Aryans and the members of an inferior race was a crime. Whom do eugenicists want to eliminate? Brutus or Caesar? Both violated the laws of their country. If 18th century eugenists had prevented alcohol addicts from generating children, their planning would have eliminated Beethoven. It must be emphasized again, there is no such thing as a scientific ought. Which men are superior and which are inferior can only be decided by personal value judgments, not liable to verification or falsification. The eugenicists delude themselves in assuming that they are themselves to be called to decide what qualities, which men are superior and which are inferior can only be decided by personal value judgments, not liable to verification or falsification. The eugenicists delude themselves in assuming that they themselves will be called to decide what qualities are to be conserved in the human stock. They are too dull to take into account the possibility that other people might make a choice according to their own value judgments. In the eyes of the Nazis, the brutal killer, the fair-haired beast, is the most perfect specimen of mankind. The mass slaughters perpetuated by the Nazis' horror camps are too horrible to be adequately described by words, but they are logical and consistent applications of doctrines and policies, parading as applied science, and proved some men who are in a sector of the natural sciences have delayed acumen and technical skill in laboratory research. And that brings us to chapter 9, so that concludes our reading for the day. Whoa, there was a lot in there. A couple of things to note. The only difference between a Nazi and a communist seems to be, according to at least what I got out of von Mises, is that the Nazis are nationalists. They believe that they Their country is the most important. You know, there a movie years ago, I'm pretty sure it was, I'm trying to decide if it was Battle of the Bulge. I think it was. Henry Fonda was in it, so you can probably verify which movie that was. Walter Matthau was, I think he was playing Ike. I forgot who Walter Matthau. No, he wasn't playing Ike. He was playing somebody else. But anyway, Walter Matthau, not Walter Matthau. Sorry. Anyway, Henry Fonda, I'm sure of. For the most part, everybody was in it. To be honest, it was one of those movies where it was so grand that everybody was in it. But when you look at one of the characters there was talking about his only hope for Germany was eternal war. And the reason for that is because Germany was poor in resources. It had lots of people, but it didn't have a lot of resources. And that's kind of what we see going on now today. Russia, though, is more poor in people than it is in resources. So I wonder how much of their conquering is trying to find the people to harvest what they have. Russia is currently falling under a problem where people are not reproducing because they're depressed and they're unable to afford children. The age of the population is getting older. Alcoholism runs rampant, and child production, to say the least, normal production is at a negative. This all leads to Russia having a problem. This country, America, the United States, is also falling into where people are having fewer and fewer kids, and we're now even sterilizing our children for various fallacious reasons. And that's a whole nother debate that can be had. But, you know, the left or the socialists, the Democrats, take your choice what you want to call them, communists, always assume that the other side is Nazi. They keep saying that they're fascists or they're Nazis. And based on what we've been learning here, that is so not entirely true. Now, I say not entirely true because it seems to me that we really have a socialism. We have the uniparty. The Democrats, there's so little to be seen between the Democrats and the Republicans. So little difference in so many ways that we really don't have anything special between the two, which is frightening because with that kind of choice between evil or between bad and evil, what do we do in the future? Well, that concludes our reading for today. I will read chapter 9 next week. It's titled The Teachings of the Soviet Experience. And remember, von Mises, this was written in 1949. This was written when the Soviet Union was still around and was a completely different animal than what I even saw in the 1970s. As a boomer, I remember the Cold War in the 1970s. And I remember what Reagan did to forestall it. The funny thing is, what Reagan did to forestall it is exactly what we are doing to ourselves. Notice I said doing to ourselves. We're spending huge amounts of money. We're spending ourselves broke. And that's how the Soviet Union was defeated, because we drove them to insanity thinking that we had all these really high-tech weapons and they had to find a way to defeat them. Many of those weapons were actual just drawing board objects. They were never, ever, most of the Star Wars system, not all of it, but we got the Patriot missile out of the Star Wars system. But most of the Star Wars system was just a pipe dream, and it was a bluff, and a brilliant one at that caused the fall of the Soviet Union. And because of the way not just America, but the world has been reacting to that breakup, we end up now with a shooting war in Ukraine that the U.S. seems intent on trying to get into. And I worry about that because, I just worry about that. There was a drone brought down yesterday. Actually, I think it was Monday night. over the Black Sea, probably an accidental collision between an Su-27 and one of our Predator type drones with the one, not the Skyhawk, so I guess it was Predator. Had a propeller engine versus a jet engine, so probably by accident, probably just because they were trying to figure out ways to bring it down without hitting it, without actually shooting it down, because, well, shooting it down would be an act of war, but having it catch on fire by dumping fuel on it or whatever else they tried to do. That was okay. I just find that entertaining. That this way is okay, but that was not. Sorry. Forgive me if that's a little bit weird. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Really appreciate the listen, and this will be up on Spotify podcast, as well as iTunes and Google as a podcast later, probably by tomorrow afternoon. And I really am grateful for your time. This has been, I'm really enjoying this read. I'm going to sort of have to end up looking up to the next book, I guess, when this is done, because we are almost done. We only got like 2 or 3 more chapters to go. But it's been a great knowledge to learn about what capitalism really is and to define some of the terms that are being misused now. Language is so important. People keep trying to redefine words, and I'm saying, personally, I say now I'm going to stand firm and tell you that you can't use that word that way. You have to use it the way it's meant to be used. You can't just change the invitation, change the meaning of a word. You don't get to. We can't have a discussion if we can't agree on the meaning of the words. You want to know how I define a word? Guess what? Look up the Noah Webster 1825 dictionary. If it's not in there, then we'll talk. Thank you very much everybody for coming. I hope you enjoyed the read, and I will continue doing this. And remember, please stay curious and seek the truth. Thank you for joining us at the Liberty Mindset. Freedom is a state of being, and liberty is a state of mind. So stay curious and seek the truth.